On January 14, 2019, Procter Gamble uploaded a 1 minute and 49-second video to YouTube. It wasn't a product demo. There were no razors in it, no close shaves, no slow-motion foam, just men bullying each other, catcalling women, a line of dads standing at barbecues muttering, "Boys will be boys," and then a voiceover, calm, almost clinical, asking, "Is this the best a man can get?" In just 48 hours, that video had over 4 million views. Within a week, it had nearly 30 million. Viral outrage was sparked, and the video's comment section was a war zone. Men were filming themselves snapping their razors in half and posting it online. The hashtag #BoycottGillette was trending not only in the US, but worldwide. One YouTube poll showed the dislike ratio running at nearly 2-to-1. And here's the key detail that makes it even worse. Gillette didn't stumble into this, they planned it, paid for it, and approved every second of that video. Their CMO even went on television to defend it, saying the backlash was the price of doing something right. 8 months later, Procter Gamble wrote down $8 billion on Gillette's value. $8 billion. The single largest write-down in the brand's 120-year history. This is the story of how the world's most dominant razor company decided to lecture its own customer. A lecture that came with a hefty price tag. To understand why Gillette made this bet, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten prior to the ad airing. For most of the 20th century, Gillette wasn't just a razor company, it was a monopoly with a logo. For most of the 20th century, Gillette wasn't just a razor company, it was a monopoly with a logo. At its peak, it controlled between 70 and 80% of the global razor market. Men didn't choose Gillette, they just bought Gillette. The way you buy ketchup, and it just assumed as Heinz ketchup. The category and the brand were nearly synonymous. In 2005, Procter Gamble bought Gillette for $57 billion, making it at the time the largest consumer goods acquisition in history. Procter & Gamble called it a cornerstone of their portfolio. Warren Buffett, who owned a significant stake in Gillette, called it a dream deal. Analysts called it a sure thing. And for a while, it was. But somewhere around 2010, something started shifting. Quietly at first, and then faster. It all began when a guy named Michael Dubbin filmed a low-budget video in a warehouse in Los Angeles that he uploaded to YouTube. The video showed him walking through the warehouse, cracking jokes, while a man in a bear costume wandered in the background. It cost about $4,500 to make and generated 12,000 orders in just 48 hours. It had one brutally simple pitch. Gillette razors are overpriced and you know it. This was the start of Dollar Shave Club. At this time, Gillette's flagship Fusion Pro Glide cartridge was retailing for $6 per blade. $6 for a piece of plastic and metal you throw away after a week. Dollar Shave Club was offering blades for as little as $1 a month. Harry's, another startup that launched in 2013, was doing the same thing with a sleeker, more premium aesthetic aimed at younger men. These weren't fringe players. By 2015, Dollar Shave Club had captured 8% of the US razor cartridge market. That might not sound catastrophic, but remember that's 8% to a 3-year-old company with a warehouse video, in a market Gillette had owned for decades. This was a signal of what was coming next. And that signal was this. Men, particularly younger men, no longer felt loyal to Gillette. The brand had become invisible to them in the worst possible way. Not hated, it's just there. A thing their dad used. Gillette's US market share, which had sat comfortably above 70% for years, had dropped to roughly 54% by 2016, then creeping lower still to 2017 and 18. Procter & Gamble responded the way large companies typically respond to disruption. Slowly, then expensively. They tried launching their own subscription service. They cut prices on some product lines. They pushed new blade technology. None of it worked. Meanwhile, in 2016, Dollar Shave Club was acquired by Unilever for $1 billion, and Harry's raised over $375 million in venture funding. The insurgents weren't going away, and so inside Procter & Gamble's boardrooms and marketing departments, a different kind of conversation started happening. One about brand identity, about what Gillette stood for, about whether the problem wasn't the product at all, but the story being told around it. Since 1989, Gillette had run some version of the same campaign, the best a man can get. It was aspirational. Clean-cut men, athletic bodies, confident smiles. It sold an image of masculine achievement, and Gillette was the tool that got you there. 30 years later, that image felt dated to a segment of the population as the cultural conversation around masculinity took a dramatic shift. #MeToo had exploded in October 2017. Toxic masculinity was front-page news. And inside Gillette's marketing team, someone made the argument that this was actually an opportunity. If the brand was invisible to young men, maybe the way to make it visible again was to say something bold, to stand for something and have a point of view. It was a gamble dressed up as a strategy, and they decided to go all in. The person most responsible for what came next was Procter & Gamble's chief brand officer, Marc Pritchard. He had been pushing a broader philosophy across all of Procter & Gamble's brands for several years. The idea was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. Brands needed to take stands and have values. In a crowded marketplace where products were increasingly commoditized, the thinking went the brands that meant something would win. Pritchard had been vocal about this publicly. In speeches and interviews going back to 2016, He argued for Procter & Gamble to step away from the traditional advertising and toward what he called brand building with a purpose. He pointed to their Always campaign, the #LikeAGirl video from 2014, as proof of concept. That video challenged the idea that doing something like a girl was an insult. It went viral. It won awards. It was widely credited with strengthening the Always brand among younger female consumers. The logic then was, if it worked for Always with women, why couldn't it work for Gillette with men? That's the internal reasoning you have to understand. This wasn't a rogue decision made by one reckless executive. This was an extension of a company-wide philosophy that had produced real results in another category. Smart people looked at the data, looked at the culture, and looked at what had worked before to come to this decision. The agency brought in to create the campaign was Grey New York, one of the most respected advertising agencies in the world. One of the most respected advertising agencies in the world. They worked with Procter & Gamble before and knew the brand well. They were given a brief that was, by all accounts, genuinely ambitious. Redefine what the best a man can get means in the modern world. Take the 30-year-old tagline and evolve it with the goal of making Gillette relevant again to a new generation of men. The creative team landed on the culturally relevant concept of toxic masculinity, specifically the idea that Gillette, as a brand that had spent 3 decades celebrating manhood, had a unique responsibility to challenge the worst expressions of it. Bullying, harassment, the passive acceptance of bad behavior summed up in the phrase, "boys will be boys." Gillette's brand director at the time, Pankaj Bala, described the thinking in interviews after the launch. They wanted to acknowledge how Gillette's version of masculinity was incomplete, the version their 30 years of advertising had reflected. They had a unique platform to showcase that men were more than what this version of masculinity portrayed them to be. And here's the thing. This idea had great potential if it celebrated positive masculine behavior without framing the entire gender as a problem to be corrected. The brief, in theory, had room for that. What got made was something else. The ad, officially titled "We Believe the Best Men Can Be," opened with montages of news coverage about sexual harassment and bullying. It showed men in the lineup, arms crossed, doing nothing while bad things happened around them. It replayed the phrase, "boys will be boys," 3 times in the first 30 seconds, each time attached to a scene of male failure. The overall framing wasn't, "Here are great men, be like them." Instead it was, "Here is what men have been, and it's not good enough." Gillette uploaded the ad to YouTube on January 14, 2019, and simultaneously pushed it across their social channels and television buys. It was a full-scale launch, a statement they were committing to. Shortly after the launch, Gary Coombe, Gillette's new global brand president, said in an interview that they knew the ad would be controversial. They expected debate. What they did not expect, and what they seemed genuinely unprepared for, was the speed and ferocity of what came next. The moment the ad went live, the point of no return wasn't just crossed, it vanished from the rearview mirror entirely. There was absolutely no going back. The first 24 hours were ugly. Within hours, the YouTube comment section became one of the most hostile spaces on the internet, overwhelmingly comprised of men expressing more than just disappointment, something closer to betrayal. The top comments weren't about politics or culture wars, they were personal. "I've used Gillette my whole life. My dad used Gillette. Never again." By the end of the first day, the video had accumulated more dislikes than likes at a ratio that kept widening. A YouGov poll conducted in the days following the launch found that Gillette's consumer perception score had dropped more than half among men in the United States. It wasn't a dip, it was a total collapse. The boycott calls were immediate and loud. Men posted videos of themselves throwing Gillette products in the trash. Others filmed themselves switching to Harry's or Dollar Shave Club, the exact competitors Gillette was already bleeding customers to. The irony was almost too clean. The ad designed to win back disengaged younger men was actively pushing them toward the rising alternatives. Conservative media amplified everything. Tucker Carlson dedicated a segment to it. Piers Morgan called it an absurd, vindictive, man-hating video. The Daily Wire, Breitbart, and dozens of similar outlets ran the story as evidence of corporate America's ideological agenda. But here's what often gets lost in the retelling. The backlash wasn't only coming from the right. Some of the most pointed criticism came from advertising and branding professionals with no political axe to grind. They called it a mess of a campaign. Not because of its values, but because of its targeting logic. His argument was precise. Gillette's problem was losing price-sensitive younger men to cheaper competitors. The ad wasn't addressing that problem. It was addressing a cultural conversation that those same men were likely to experience as a lecture. Gillette's CMO, Mark Dunn, went on television to defend the campaign. He said that the brand had received an enormous amount of support, and that they stood behind the message. Technically, he wasn't wrong. The ad also generated significant support. Feminist publications praised it. Some men said it made them feel seen in a positive way. But here's the asymmetry that matters in consumer brand dynamics. The people who loved the ad were not necessarily Gillette's customers. Or more precisely, they weren't the customers Gillette was losing. The men who applauded the ad's message were largely already engaged with conversations about masculinity and gender. They tended to skew younger, more urban, more college-educated. Some of them probably did use Gillette, but they weren't the ones canceling subscriptions. The ones canceling subscriptions were men who felt that a brand they'd grown up with had just looked them in the eye and told them they were part of the problem. That feeling, regardless of intent, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse once it takes hold. By February 2019, third-party retail data was showing measurable declines in Gillette's sales velocity at major U.S. retailers. The ad hadn't arrested the decline, it had steepened it. Inside Procter & Gamble, the mood was reportedly tense. Sources described internal disagreement about whether to double down on the campaign's messaging or quietly pivot. The external position remained one of confidence. Privately, the picture was more complicated. What makes this story genuinely painful? The people who made this ad weren't villains. They were marketers who looked at a real cultural moment, a real problem their brand was facing, and tried to build a bridge between them. They believed in what they made, and they were watching it burn in real time with no tools to put out the fire. By the time the dust began to settle in late February and March, Gillette was no longer talking about the campaign. No follow-up ads, no extended rollout, no doubling down. The We Believe campaign, launched with the scale and confidence of a full brand repositioning, quietly disappeared from their active marketing. It's worth asking a simple question. Did any brand actually pull this off? Is there a version of purpose-driven marketing aimed at men that worked? The answer is yes, and the contrast is instructive. Take Dove, for example. Unilever's skincare brand faced a remarkably similar strategic challenge in the early 2000s. Their market was commoditized. Younger consumers felt disconnected from the brand, and the cultural conversation around body image and beauty standards was shifting in ways that felt like either a threat or an opportunity. In 2004, Dove launched the Real Beauty campaign. It featured real women, not models, of different ages, sizes, and ethnicities. It challenged narrow beauty standards directly. It was, by any measure, a bold cultural statement from a brand that sold soap. It worked. Dove sales grew from $2.5 billion to over $4 billion within the first decade. The campaign won every major advertising award. It's still running in some form today, more than 20 years later. So why did Dove succeed where Gillette stumbled? The difference was their emotional positioning. Dove's campaign said to its customers, "You are enough, and the world has been lying to you about that." It was an embrace and a validation. It made these women feel seen and defended. Gillette's campaign said to its customers, "You've been part of the problem, and it's time to do better." Even if that message was wrapped up in a call to positive action, the entry point was accusation. The first emotion it asked men to feel was guilt. That's not a small distinction by any measure. Now look at Harry's, who had never made a single ad about masculinity or culture or social responsibility. Their marketing was almost aggressively simple: a well-designed razor at a fair price, delivered to your door with no nonsense. Their brand voice was warm, a little self-deprecating, and completely non-judgmental. In the 2 years following Gillette's misfiring, Harry's revenue skyrocketed from $150 million to $375 million. They weren't winning on ideology. They were winning on trust and simplicity. They gave men a product that respected their intelligence and their wallet. No lecture required. And then there's Axe, also owned by Unilever. Axe had spent years building a brand identity that was, frankly, juvenile. Ads built entirely around the premise that their body spray would make women throw themselves at you. By the mid-2010s, that positioning had aged badly, and their sales reflected it. So in 2016, Axe relaunched with a campaign called Find Your Magic, encouraging men to express individuality rather than chase a narrow masculine ideal. It was a pivot toward purpose. It actually touched on similar cultural themes as Gillette's later campaign. The difference was the tone. Find Your Magic was celebratory. It said, "There are 1,000 ways to be a man, and all of them are valid." It didn't open with a montage of male failure. It opened with possibility. Axe's sales stabilized and grew following the relaunch. The campaign was widely praised. No boycotts or trending hashtags. The metaphor that keeps coming back when you look at these three examples is simple. Dove, Harry's, and Axe all understood that you can challenge your customer to be better, but you have to walk beside them instead of blocking their path. Gillette stood in front of their customers and asked them to justify themselves before they even picked up a razor. On July 30th, 2019, Procter & Gamble reported their quarterly earnings. Buried in the financial disclosures was a single line item that landed like a brick through a window. Procter & Gamble had taken an $8 billion non-cash impairment charge on Gillette. In regular people translation, Procter & Gamble was formally acknowledging Gillette was worth $8 billion less than what they'd pay for it. Not because of one ad. The write-down reflected years of market share erosion. competitive pressure, and declining brand value. But the timing, 6 months after the We Believe campaign, made the connection impossible to ignore, and Procter & Gamble's own CFO, John Moeller, acknowledged in the earnings call that the write-down reflected the challenging environment the brand was operating in, including the impact of their ad. The human consequences followed quickly. Gillette's global brand president, Gary Coombe, gave an interview to Marketing Week in August 2019 that was remarkably candid for a sitting executive. He said directly that the brand had paid a price for the ad in the short term. He estimated that they had alienated a sizable minority of their customer base. He called it a price worth paying. But the fact that he was acknowledging a price at all was itself a signal. Executives don't publicly admit their campaign's cost to their customers unless the evidence is too overwhelming to deny. Behind the scenes, the relationship with Grey New York, the agency that created the campaign, was quietly unwound. There was no dramatic public split, no press release. After decades of partnership, the relationship just ended. Gillette's market share continued to erode. By 2020, their estimated U.S. market share had fallen between 49 and 54%. For a brand that had sat above 70% less than a decade earlier, it was a structural devastation. The ad itself became a case study, not in the way Gillette would have hoped, but a case study nonetheless. It started appearing in MBA programs and marketing courses as an example of brand purpose gone wrong. The Harvard Business Review referenced it. Marketing Week named it one of the most consequential brand missteps of the decade. The We Believe campaign, which was supposed to relaunch Gillette's cultural relevance, had instead become shorthand for a specific kind of corporate miscalculation. And then there were the customers themselves, the ones who never made a YouTube video or posted a tweet, the ones who just quietly, without announcement, switched to Harry's or Dollar Shave Club, or picked up whatever other razor was the cheapest at CVS. Those customers don't show up in the headlines, they show up 6 months later in the sales data, and by then, there's very little you can do about them. In 2020 and 2021, Procter & Gamble attempted a reset and Gillette's marketing shifted noticeably. The campaigns became quieter, more product-focused, a return in some ways to functional messaging. Here's the razor, this is what a razor does, and here's why it's worth your money. The We Believe campaign was nowhere in sight. Whether that represented a genuine strategic recalibration or simply a retreat was hard to tell from the outside. What was clear was this: between 2015 and 2020, Gillette had gone from a brand that dominated its category so completely that competitors barely registered on the map, to a brand fighting for every percentage point of a share against upstarts that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Though the ad didn't cause this, it definitely accelerated it. And in a business where consumer trust is the only moat you actually have, acceleration in the wrong direction is very hard to reverse. The full picture of damage when you step back and look at it: $8 billion in written down brand value, a 20+ point drop in US market share over a decade, the loss of a key agency relationship, a brand perception score that plummeted in days and took years to only partially recover, and a generation of younger male consumers who associated Gillette, if they even thought about it at all, with being told that they were not good enough. That last one, that's the one that doesn't show up in the quarterly earnings, and that's the one that keeps the lights off the longest. Here's the thing that keeps nagging at you when you really sit with this story. Gillette wasn't wrong about the culture. The conversations happening in 2018 and 2019 about masculinity and the Me Too movement, about cultural behavioral standards, about the behavioral standards we hold men to, those were real conversations, important ones. The issues the ad pointed at were genuine. Bullying is real, harassment is real. The passive acceptance of bad behavior is also real. And yet the campaign failed badly. So what does that tell us? It tells us something uncomfortable about the relationship with brands and the people that buy from them. There's a version of brand purpose that works. We saw it with Dove, Axe, and dozens of other campaigns that successfully navigated cultural moments without deteriorating their customer base. And there's a version that doesn't work. The difference, it turns out, has almost nothing to do with whether the underlying message is right or wrong. It has everything to do with whether the brand has earned the right to deliver it. Dove spent years building a relationship with women before it told them the beauty industry had been lying to them. That message landed as an ally speaking truth. When Gillette told men that masculinity had a toxicity problem, they were doing it as a brand that had spent 30 years selling an aspirational vision of that exact masculinity. The best a man can get wasn't just a tagline, it was a promise. And you can't spend 3 decades making that promise and then turn around and imply the thing you've been selling was actually part of the problem. That's not a political observation, it's a psychological one. There's also a deeper business question buried in here about what purpose-driven marketing is actually for. The honest answer is that it's supposed to sell things, not fix society. not drive cultural change. Those outcomes might happen as byproducts, but a brand campaign that doesn't move product is not a brave cultural statement, it's an expensive mistake. Gillette's leadership seemed to genuinely believe they were doing something meaningful. And maybe they were. But meaningful and effective are not the same thing. And in business, the gap between those two words is where careers end or are born. The broader question the story leaves hanging is one that every major consumer brand is still wrestling with right now. In a polarized world, is it possible for a mass market brand to take a cultural stand without fracturing the mass market it depends on? The honest answer based on the evidence seems to be very rarely. Procter & Gamble had continued pushing brand purpose across its portfolio. Some of it has worked, some of it hasn't. Gillette itself has remained cautious. As of the mid-2020s, the brand is still the largest razor company in the world by revenue. It still sells hundreds of millions of blades every year. It is not by any measure dead, but it is definitely diminished. And the question of whether it can ever fully recover the cultural position it once held, that effortless, unquestioned dominance that didn't need any message because it was the message, that question remains genuinely open. What Gillette learned at a cost of a mere $8 billion is a lesson that sounds almost embarrassingly simple once you say it out loud. People don't buy razors from brands that make them feel bad about themselves. The best a man can get turned out to be a brand that trusted him in the first place.